welcome to Lights Out. I'm John Weiss,
And I'm Andy Henderson.
and today we are going to talk about something a little unique. So we're going to start off today with a report, and I want to float a statistic by you, Andy, and get your take on this. So according to Gartner, today around 10% of enterprise generated data is created and processed outside of a traditional centralized data center or cloud. Now, that's 10% today. By 2025, Gartner predicts that this figure is going to reach 75%. So only almost 4 years from now, right? It's going to be a massive growth, 10% to 75%. So 65% shift, more emphasis of data being processed outside of the conventional, let's call it data center or cloud. What's your take on that, Andy? I'd love to get maybe your perspective.
So I wonder, I think when I've talked about edge versus cloud in the past, I've always said, I think there's going to still be quite a bit done in the cloud. And I would wonder, do you think they're trying to say that there's going to be a lot moved from the cloud, or there's just going to be that much growth at the edge? You know what I mean?
I think there's, I get you. And I think that there's going to be growth. I'm not sure that this is saying that there's going to be a 65% reduction in the cloud, so that 65% more will happen on premise or at the edge. I think what it's saying is that as organizations start to adopt new technologies, they're starting to collect data that did not exist before. So more sensors, more smart connected assets. So just an abundance of data that wasn't there in the past.
Sure. So I could see, like, you've got an accelerometer that's measuring data at a high frequency, and you do some first passing out. Maybe you do like a Fourier transform or something at the edge, and all that gets passed up to the cloud for further analysis are the results of that frequency analysis of that data. So I could see that makes sense to me, because lots of the arguments that are made for the edge are that you can't do that. There's too much latency for passing things from the edge to the cloud and then back down to do like real-time control of a process. And I think there's still going to be a bunch of years where people are still in the loop, still making the final call on adjustments. And so that, to me, that's still like the latency of passing data from the edge to the cloud and back. It's still fine if you're considering that a human's still going to be in the loop, still making adjustments, still doing the corrections. If you're thinking about real-time adjustments, you do need to cut that latency down, and for those types of applications, the cloud does present some challenges.
But I guess your train of thought, if I understand correctly, a lot of people, that's the first thing they latch onto when you talk about cloud. If they don't want to do something in the cloud, a lot of times they point to latency. Oh, no, too much latency, right? We need insights right now, like as quickly as possible. So if I understand correctly, you're saying, well, a lot of the stuff that we do from realistically from IoT implementations, it's few and far between that people have that kind of mission critical stuff running on this technology where humans not in the loop, that a millisecond of latency would be catastrophic. That's really it. We're just not there yet as far as technology goes. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And then the other one would be that you hear a lot is security. People are concerned about the cloud being owned and controlled by someone else. And what happens if my data gets out there? How secure is it? And does it then start to commingle with other people's data? And is there a chance that somebody else is going to see my data? That type of thing. Yeah. So I'd say latency and security are the two big concerns that I hear over against the cloud. I don't know. What do you hear?
Well, recently, I've been hearing more around reliability. People are starting to trust the cloud infrastructure a little bit less than they used to, I think. And why I say that, it wasn't all that long ago, Microsoft, the Office 365 suite and Azure had a pretty large outage. I think it was the first quarter of 2020, if I remember correctly. And so even these big hyperscalers are running into situations where they're going down. And if you have mission critical activity or something that's really important to the business being processed in the cloud, especially in a cloud that's not yours, it's not your data center that you can access from anywhere, right? It's one of the third-party providers or whatever. You can't really control that stuff. You're really at the mercy of them, and usually that's fine because they're experts. That's their business.
That was going to be my argument exactly. Is
Yeah,
it
right.
if they go down once in memorable history, and as far back as we can remember, right? If I'm owning the cloud, or if I'm owning that large data infrastructure, it probably goes down a few more times because
Sure.
that's not my core business. That's not what I'm specialized at doing, whereas they are.
Yeah,
But
but it begs the question: is it really just one time that the cloud has had this some kind of catastrophic failure, or are there smaller failures along the way that could disrupt mission critical business in an infrastructure that you can't control? Maybe you don't even know that there was an outage, that something went down. It kind of reminds me of like Netflix and Hulu. How many times have you tried to play a title and you get that, oop, this title is not available right now, please try again? And you have to hit the refresh button a few times and then boom, it'll play your show, right? Kind of the same thing. I can't go hit the reset button on Netflix because something's not working right.
yeah, but what do you do? You go say, well, I can't watch Netflix. I'm going to go watch one of the other one of the other
Yeah, Hulu it
subscription
is
services.
tonight, or Disney Plus. I don't know, but food for thought. It's not something that I used to hear, but I am starting to hear it more now, where they're saying, you know what, all that cloud stuff, why don't you go ahead and bring this on prem and let me run it within the four walls of my factory? And if I do that, sure, it's my responsibility to own the infrastructure, but perhaps I can regulate it a little bit better. I don't know.
Yeah,
Just something I'm
it's a
hearing.
fair point. I would say, it like any decision, any business decision, you have to weigh like what is it going to what am I, by me saying I'm going to own it and maintain it and um care for it, right? I have to staff properly. That staff has to have a certain amount of expertise. And what is it going to cost you to do all that versus the cost of effectively outsourcing it to one of these cloud providers? But
Yeah.
it's
A lot
that's
of times it's the business requirements and the business needs that drive that anyway. I think where does the compute power have to exist? And probably a good segue here actually to get into maybe some of the differences between cloud and edge and maybe why people pick one over the other. There's a lot of talk in the industry. You and I have debated this a little bit, but there's a lot of talk in the market and in the industry around people doing what, a cloud to edge shift or transition, or focusing more on the edge versus the cloud. Um, and it's almost creating like a partisan approach to this kind of technology, where people are saying, you have to think cloud first, and other people are saying, no, you have to think edge first, which it's really bizarre to me because in typical fashion, I'm kind of in the middle, and I'm like, well, maybe we should just be thinking about distributed architecture first, so we can do all of our data processing really anywhere that it has to happen based on the need. Um,
yeah.
but maybe just to reel it back in a little bit. So if we look at some of the reasons why people might choose one over the other, we did talk about latency, and there's validity to that, right? If it
Yep.
goes to the cloud, there's going to be some latency.
Yeah.
There may be intermittent connectivity if you're not if your infrastructure for connectivity to the internet's not really robust in a remote location. Maybe you depend on satellite connectivity.
Absolutely. Yep.
You and I have been in factories where there's bandwidth challenges, where they have to actually throttle the data that goes in and out because they'll just bog down the whole network, and then you end up with a queue of data that has to go out, and then stuff gets lost.
Yeah, I've worked in places where it's a very real that where it's a large site and there's construction constantly happening somewhere on the site, and it's entirely possible that an excavator's digging and accidentally hits the fiber the fiber cable that's bringing the internet to the facility. It's an entirely possible thing that can happen, and you're exactly right. You can't, there's a huge fear that's rightly so, that something like that happens. And then what does it do to my operation? Does it shut my entire operation down because now I had some mission critical system that was remote? The same point we were making just a moment ago.
Yeah. And it's a legitimate concern.
Yeah.
Another topic that I hear a lot of people talk about, it's the cost, the comparison between what is it going to cost me to uh, do some kind of compute process or some kind of data storage mechanism. What does it cost to do it on premise? What does it cost to do it in the cloud? And how do those scale from a cost factor? What's your take on that?
There are the cloud folks have a, what's the word I'm looking for? Scale, right?
Yeah.
When you get to a certain scale, the cost should be less of hardware in general. And I would believe that to be true. But again, also go back to what we were talking about just a moment ago with people. There's a certain skill set and a certain number of people and a certain skill set of the people that you have to have in order to maintain these, whether you're maintaining devices at the edge or a massive server farm or something. And if you say you're going to do it yourself, then you're competing with those other cloud providers in the acquisition of that talent, and uh, it can be expensive. And so I would say hardware costs are one thing, and I'd put the benefit of hardware on the cloud side, uh, and then there's the people, and then that could be a toss up, right? Just how well can you?
Yeah, I guess a lot of it depends how intricate of a solution we're talking about implementing. Because a lot of this,
Sure.
there are a lot of details. Like they say, the devil's in the details, and a lot of this stuff, right? Depending on what we're talking about actually implementing. Some common challenges that I hear from people I talk to is that when they talk about the edge, most folks that I've spoken with are pretty confident that they can model out a cost structure when it comes to doing a total cost of ownership exercise or an ROI type exercise, where they can say, all right, we're pretty confident that we can model what it's going to cost us to buy, let's say, an HPE Edgeline server or a Dell Power Edge or whatever. I know what the hardware is going to cost me. I've got a very, clear indication from a software vendor what that's going to cost me. So I can basically model what is this going to cost me to onboard whatever I need at the edge and do whatever I need at the edge. And I hear some different comments when folks are talking to me about cloud, where they say, yeah, it's really, really easy to get started. It's super cheap, costs like pennies on the dollar to start onboarding devices in AWS or Azure. So cheap, we give the engineering department a credit card and just go swipe it, right? We don't need a PO, nothing like that. And but then what seems to happen, and what I've heard about a lot, is that low barrier to entry quickly snowballs into a pretty expensive bill from some of these hyperscalers. And I've heard of companies spending, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per month on things that started as kind of science projects. But, another department comes in, they onboard a few more devices, and then these guys come in and they onboard a few more devices. And next thing you know, you've got almost an enterprise scale science project that costs a ton of money in consumption fees.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to model because it's not always so transparent what you may pay at different device brackets, and who the hell knows how many API calls I'm going to make in a month. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
These are real challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have had something similar happen where I signed up for what I thought to be a low cost tier, and then I was hit with a $1,000 bill.
Holy cow.
I wonder though that if you're just handing out the credit card to everybody to start using, it makes sense to me that they'll just start piling in and doing their own. The example you're given about creating an account, and then other people start joining and start adding in things, and the bill just keeps on.
It can
That
get
can
out of
happen.
control, I think,
Yeah.
pretty quickly.
Yeah, sure. Just I think the takeaway for anybody listening to this is just be careful. Don't try to have some sort of strategy around how you're going to monitor and regulate what happens.
Yeah. And think about how you can mitigate costs that might be unnecessary, like in these hybrid approaches where you've got some edge compute and some cloud compute, doing a lot of data aggregation and data normalization and things like that at the edge. So that a good example of this is if I've got, let's say I've got an air compressor and I'm checking the PSI in it, a big industrial air compressor. I don't need to know that the PSI of the pressure in there has not changed every second, right
Mhm.
on the second. I don't
Yeah.
need to pay to store that in the cloud. What I want is the variation when the PSI drops or goes over something that's too high.
Yep.
So in an instance like that, a lot of organizations have implemented edge technology to do the compute power there to see, okay, no change, no change, no change, second by second, and then, oh, we got to change. Let's send that to the cloud.
Yeah.
That's one way people I've seen mitigate some costs in this area.
But yeah, I've seen that too. I mean, that's a common practice in a lot of historians is that
Yeah,
in order to minimize, keep the size of the historian down, they're polling on a cyclic on a frequency, and if there's no change as governed by some threshold, don't log the data. And it's in the old days it was largely just to keep the size of stuff down, but I think today it has other implications as well around network traffic and a host of other things. And then a common architecture that you'll see a lot is that there'll be some sort of um, maybe like a SCADA system on the floor that's doing that and logging data to a historian, and then there's going to be a connection between that historian and the cloud for things like data and analytics um, of the data of whatever gets sent up.
yeah. What are just thinking through architecture in my mind while you're talking, what are some common implementations that you've seen in manufacturers, just in your own experience doing this kind of stuff? Have you seen manufacturers more likely to invest in cloud first or on-prem first, or are they going maybe somewhere in the middle with like a private data center that they own that's accessible across the factories? What is there a norm?
I, my personal opinion is that IT especially if you're talking about big companies, IT organizations inside those big companies have been maintaining and governing data centers for a while, um, decades, and so the cloud has been something something relatively new. And what surprised me at first and then later not so much, right, is that we talked to some of these big industrial companies and say, who's your cloud provider, thinking there was just one, and they'd say, oh, we use them all. we have we have Azure, AWS, Google, uh, we use them all. um, and in addition to their own data centers and their whatever they're doing internally. And I think it's part of the reason why I think that is just looking to see what do the different providers have to offer. Um and maybe there's a particular service on one of the that one provider offers that's better than the service that a different provider offers, um, and that is a good reason to use it. Or maybe just the people involved have experience with one over the other, and that's what they choose. I don't know. How about you? What do you see as far as like um, what how people approach the strategy of edge versus cloud?
I've seen over the last, I don't know, call it 2 years or so, I've seen a much stronger insistence from people that are adopting this technology on actually having it on premise. A lot of even smaller manufacturers, but especially large manufacturers that I've worked with over the last 2 years, they've really wanted everything within the four walls of the factory or within their own data center. Um, or they have a private instance in one of the cloud providers. So they've got their own dedicated space in something like Azure or AWS, and they want parts of it there. But I have seen over the last 2 years or so much more focus on, hey, we want this right here where we're collecting the data. That's where we want to run the software. We don't want to send it out of the factory. We don't want to send it out of our data center. Security is, of course, a hot topic in manufacturing forever, but it's a really hot topic in IoT and specifically industrial IoT. And there are so many things that you have to consider from a security perspective. The sensors, I mean, the sensors themselves, can it be spoofed? Can somebody come in and swap one out? Can they be tampered with? The software, can the software detect if something's been spoofed? Or how is it encrypting the data that's being sent around? And then all of those things get amplified when it leaves the premise. So now when I have to send it up to a cloud provider, how can I ensure that the data that's leaving my factory or my industrial operation, how can I ensure that that's the same data that arrived in a cloud facility? Which, I don't know, maybe that sounds kind of crazy that that's a concern, but most of us that work in the space, I mean, you're probably painfully aware, Andy, that's a real concern, right? How's the protocol secured in transit and all this kind of stuff?
But wouldn't you also say that like a lot of the so with a lot of companies, they'll have a strategy for digital transformation, whatever that means to people, right? And a lot of that involves getting access to the data in the places from the places where you're talking about and
Yeah.
bringing it to a corporate owned and managed data farm and server. Don't you have similar concerns? Because at some point, um, the yeah, you've probably got some sort of VPN or tunnel set up from one site to the other, but you're probably using the same pipes that the rest of the internet traffic flows on, which is in some ways similar to connecting to I don't know, an Azure cloud,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, unless you're using, like to your point, if you're using a VPN, you have some secured tunnels through different ports and things like that. It's a little bit more secure than just sending it over, 886 or whatever MQTT common port is, something like that. But so I do agree with you. I think from factory to data center or factory to cloud, pretty comparable when it comes to security concerns because data is now leaving the four walls of your facility. The one that you don't have those concerns, it's when you do everything at the edge. So when you're doing the data collection, the data analysis, what's it telling me, and what should I do about it? All of that kind of reactionary and predictive, proactive type activities that we want to do from data. When you do all of those things at the edge, which a lot of companies seem to be wanting to do these days, that then you alleviate a lot of those concerns. But most projects, somewhere along the project plan, they call for viewing an enterprise type view of all the factories. And then you're kind of right back to the same situation where, well, the only way to do that is to aggregate all of the factory data up or all of the asset data up.
Yeah, and I would even argue that whoever it is analyzing that data, why do they want it collected in the, I mean, you want it to make better decisions, but you also want it to make your life easier.
Yeah.
People want operations leaders to be able to roll out of bed in the morning, take their shower, immediately see on their phone that if there's an issue or something, so they can start calling, heading things off, thinking about it on their way to work, whatever, right? That's always a use case that comes up. And so like, in that scenario, the data is not like, the argument would be that we may think that everything's going to happen within the physical bounds, and then it will have some sort of air gap between that system and whatever its physical location is and the rest of the world. But I don't know, in order for it to be convenient to be used in a convenient sort of way, like who's going to be doing all of the analysis? Are you going to make those people relocate to your facility? And in the time of a pandemic, right? Is that even possible in the first place?
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
that's speaking to where we
That's a
are
great
today.
point. And it just goes right back to what we always say, the business driver, the use case. What's the reason behind implementing the technology? That's fundamentally that will, for as long as I can see, be the driver of why you do what you do with this kind of technology. It's not when we talk about IoT and we talk about this kind of emerging tech, it's not technology that people are even buying from us. Let's just be real about it. People are buying business outcomes. How do I
Hmm.
become more efficient? How do I give my
Yep.
customers more visibility into my supply chain? um, that's what they're investing in. They're not investing in the cool dashboarding technology that you have, right? Because all your competitors have it too. Let's just be real.
Right. Yep. 100% agreed.
Interesting stuff. All right. So maybe in summation here, Andy, as we wrap, because I think we're just about on time. Um, what would we say if we summarize this? What would we say? Some final words, some words of wisdom or advice when picking a starting point: cloud versus edge, edge versus cloud. Do you start with the ambitions of doing both and be cognizant of maybe more of a hybrid approach? What do you think?
I go back to what you just said a moment ago. It's about the outcome. What are you trying to achieve? And I'm going to go out on a limb and say 99.999% of the time, that outcome is going to involve both edge and cloud. It's not going to be a it's not going to be a one or the other. But I wouldn't frame it in terms of I'm going to base everything I do off of a purely edge strategy or a purely cloud strategy, because I don't think that's practical.
Totally agree. Hybrid mentality, distributed architecture, plan big, start small, like we always talk about.
Yeah.
Love it. All right.
What about,
Awesome.
I think there's another, before we completely close, I think there's another term, the fog, right?
The
That,
fog.
that people keep talking about, and correct me if you have a different understanding of it, but it is the fact that it's not the edge or the cloud. It's all of the above, and it's in between.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And funny enough, it's much like many things in this business. It's something that, we heard years and years and years ago. It's
Yeah.
just it's come back around to be cool again, but you're not quite at the edge, you're not quite in the cloud. I think fundamentally when we talk about the fog, I think that's really, if you boil it down, it's a distributed architecture, right? You're using the best of both worlds to achieve a business outcome or a technical deliverable. So, great point. Great point. All right. Well, I think we're out of time, Andy. So would love to hear in typical fashion from our listeners, our subscribers. How's the journey going for you? Are you using the cloud? Are you using the edge? Are you using both? Where'd you start? Where'd you end? Tell us about it. Until next time, thanks so much.